Very well.
Good evening and welcome to this week's Global Christian Perspectives with me, Chris Eyre, and at this point from the left-hand side of the Atlantic, Tony Mitchell. We're expecting Elgin Hushbeck to join us, and Henry is currently holding a watching brief only. If we can start in with the topic to start off with, which I suspect is going to keep coming back to haunt us. We've now had the second primary in the States. Tony, what's your feeling? Obviously, Trump's back on top for the Republicans, and although Bernie being in front in New Hampshire perhaps wasn't a surprise, 21 points does seem to be quite a large margin.
Um, I, as far as Sanders and Bernie and Hillary, Sanders and Clinton,
Mm-hmm.
I'm of the opinion that that one you just set aside.
Okay.
Basically, everybody knew he was going to pull that one out.
Mm-hmm.
And now, I noticed in the follow-up that both parties have what are called super delegates.
Yeah.
And Hillary got the majority of the super delegates. I may be, quote, old, but I have never liked that kind of, that always struck me as kind of rigging the election.
Mm-hmm.
Because now, even though she lost, she's got more delegates. And
Mm-hmm.
that, the Republicans are the Republicans. And I am a Christian, so I shall not speak ill of those.
Okay.
The thing there was, because it was an open primary,
Mm-hmm.
my own personal thought was that Trump was going to do well simply because it didn't require the manpower and the organization that Iowa did. With the,
Right.
the caucuses, I would much rather teach someone differential equations, which I don't know, than try to explain a caucus.
Okay.
But what I do know, and the bad part about, well, of course, when I went to I went to the University of Iowa. That's where I got my doctorate.
Right.
But that was before the caucuses became the thing.
Okay.
So I don't know anything. All I know is it takes a lot of intensive organization. You've got to have a lot of people because of the way it's set up. You bring them all to. Trump didn't have that, from what I could gather.
Hmm.
And as a result, he wasn't going to do well.
Okay.
Fair
enough. There's going to be plenty of time to look at things develop in the future, anyhow.
I do want to ask since we're on the different side of the pond,
Sure.
how did the debate in Parliament? Did they finally resolve whether or not they were going to ban Trump?
As far as I know, they didn't, but the very fact that they've talked about it does indicate that he might be somewhat disastrous from a foreign policy point of view if he actually got elected.
Would that if they had voted to ban him, because that's the interesting question is because when Iran was on the no-go list,
Mm-hmm.
the president could come in and to speak to Parliament, or not to Parliament, to the UN, but that because he was the elected leader of a foreign government. I was kind of interested to see how that would play out.
I have no idea, and it would have made for very interesting diplomacy at the very least.
I could be really snide and say, would he have been allowed to play golf?
Whoa. Sore point that in some quarters. Certainly it's unprecedented for our Parliament to be making that kind of comment about a presidential candidate in the States, and it just does go some way to indicating that outside the States he is a worrying character, shall we say.
Well, I would worry about all of them.
Okay, let's move on from that. The actual announcement yesterday of the observation of gravitational waves from the LIGO project, I found really quite an exciting development from the point of view of a former physicist. What's your feeling been on that?
Well, I got to go back and change a paragraph on a book that I'm I'm looking at the publisher. I got to go back and change a paragraph.
Oh,
Well, that's the problem with writing. I gave up trying to write a chemistry textbook
hmm
simply because I was always attuned to the current model,
yeah.
which always meant revision.
hmm
Now, if I don't know how Henry we're talking about my book, Creation the Science. I don't know how it's going to be sold. I'm preparing a lot of links to take it out to and so I'm always worried I'm going to hit a link and the link's not going to work, and
Yeah.
I haven't figured out all the references. But the good news is it shows the viability of science. Now,
Yeah.
I don't think, off the top of my head, that Einstein predicted gravity waves per se.
hmm
He didn't predict black holes. But the consequences of his work did predict them.
hmm
And that's the idea of a theory. What is going to come about?
Yes. Yeah.
And for me personally, because my original very first science fair project was on Newton's law of universal gravitation, I got a stake in this game, as it were. I got somewhere. Oh, excuse me. Where did we put my posters? You remember?
I have no idea.
Somewhere in our apartment are my posters
Uh-huh.
that I had from the 9th grade, which I wanted to frame one of these days. But they are. I know where they are. So I've always been interested in that. And again, the theory, the explanation, and now we have it. Now the only one left that I'm concerned with is the proton. If we observe the decay of a proton,
hmm
pretty well got, I think, most of the basic unknown questions.
Yeah. I'm certainly impressed with 100 years later another bit of confirmation that Einstein was thinking along the right lines in the general theory, and it's a practical demonstration. It's also an observation of two colliding black holes, which is also a first. And I remember my second year dissertation at university was called Black Holes, White Holes and Wormholes, and at that point they were a purely speculative entity, and now they're not. So I'm seeing reality, I'm seeing facts to back up the theory in a most reassuring way there.
Well, it also shows from the teaching standpoint
Mhm.
that I guess perseverance is more important than anything else, because going back, they were speaking about the proton.
Mhm.
The decay of the proton. Those experiments have been going on for at least 30 years.
Yeah.
And and of course, what we're looking at is if the decay of the proton is on the framework of the age of the universe,
Mhm.
it's going to be
Yeah.
a very lucky. There's going to be a lot of there's going to be a lot of luck involved.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely. Okay. I particularly thought that was apposite because we had a slight exchange between myself and Elgin last week. I was saying that I am a methodological naturalist, and this raised some uncomfortable areas as far as supernaturalism was concerned in religion. Obviously, it's difficult to find that kind of confirmation for anything theological. When I produce a theological idea, I'm not entirely sure how I could test whether it's correct.
say that again.
If I produce a theological idea, I'm not entirely sure how I could test whether or not it's correct. Whereas in the case of general relativity, here we have a test that indicates correctness.
Okay. Yeah.
Hey.
I have a friend
Mm-hmm.
who was on kidney dialysis.
Mm-hmm.
He was a regular on kidney, and then one day they announced that his dialysis, the problem was gone.
Okay.
Now, I have not had a chance to talk to him in a couple of years, so I don't know where he's at now. He seems to be in good health, primarily because he still posts on Facebook, if that's an indication of health.
Yeah.
But there's that question.
Yeah.
What was it that did the problem go into remission? Did the problem get solved?
Mm-hmm.
There's a variety, were the changes that he had to undergo because he was on dialysis? And I'm almost certain there was a dietary change.
Yeah.
I didn't know, but you look at all the factors. But in the end, the doctor comes in and says, "It's gone. The problem is gone."
Okay.
Now,
from my point of view, you give thanks for that.
Yeah,
and
I'm also,
you
I
probably don't look too closely at what the causes were because that might involve you dissecting the patient.
Yeah, there are going to be some, what was it? Father Mulcahy on MASH once said to Hawkeye, "You know when you lose a patient because the patient dies. If I lose a patient, I lose their soul."
Yeah.
And how do you know that? The only way, if we, and I'm speaking as a former lay minister, if we are concerned with how many souls we save, we're in a lot of trouble because we're never going to know that answer. We just have to go out. We have to hope that we do the work and that what we say changes lives and changes the outcome. And when the day comes, we'll find out. But until then, we can't, you can't sweat it out. You have to just go on to the next point.
Indeed so. Which brings me to the next point.
That's what I thought you'd do.
Yes. The item that Australia has just cut 110 climate scientist jobs, which is basically almost all the climate scientists who were employed, on the basis, which I find interesting, that it's settled science and now all that's needed is to work out what to do about it. Whereas, as far as I can see, Australia's pretty much the only place in the southern hemisphere that is studying the ongoing results of climate change, which of course is worrying from a worldwide point of view. Do you have any thoughts there?
Well, I saw that article, and the first thing I saw when I saw that sentence about all the basic science has been done is a quote from the late 19th century that we should close the patent office here in the United States because all things that have needed to be invented have been invented.
Yes.
So there goes radio, television, computers, modern phone,
Yeah.
basically, I think that's my first comment is it's being a little short-sighted to say that basics, because this guy, this claim that all basic science has been done comes at the same time that basic science shows that a 100-year-old theory still works.
Yeah, I'm particularly sorry we don't have Elgin here for this, because he's a climate change skeptic, and he is, at the very least, adept at pointing out that there are people differing as to how fast it's happening, or as to whether there are other factors that might move things in a contrary direction, or whether it's actually a bad thing in any event, and things like that. And all of that you can find there is at the moment some room for disagreement on. So it seems to me very premature when you have people taking Elgin's position, which I may say I do not agree with in the slightest, to close down research in the area, which might convince the waverers, and some of the waverers seem to get into political power, which is slightly worrying.
Well, what always amazed me when I was, when I was teaching high school chemistry, and when I was teaching college chemistry, was this assumption that science has the exact answer.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time, why do we do multiple trials?
Mm-hmm.
You got to have at least 3, and I actually did an experiment where the entire class did 1 trial. So we had, the class it was a titration.
Mm-hmm.
I happen to be red-green colorblind, so I cannot see the endpoint for phenolphthalein.
Oh my word! Yes.
Oh yeah. And as a student, that was a disaster.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I wanted, since I couldn't tell the students what the color was, I had to have a frame of reference for them. Fortunately, I had a book with the picture.
Yeah.
I said, okay, this is the point you're seeking. Now, each person's going to do 1 trial. That's going to give us 20 trials. We got a very good, when I had to get an endpoint, I had very good results. And that's the point we have to express. There was a discussion on Facebook earlier today on the was the Christians and Science Facebook page, and it got into the point about validity.
Mm-hmm.
Can we? And actually, it was questioning a British broadcaster. It was in wasn't the Guardian? It was a Liverpool paper, I think. Mm-hmm. Anyway, there's a BBC's hired a broadcaster who's a creationist, and the discussion was we can't trust him. My point was, as long as he gives me the facts and lets me make up my own mind, if I'm listening to him, I'm okay with that. But it got into, and my point here is, you have to understand that the process of science, you're going to get a large number of pieces of data.
Absolutely so.
And every time you get one that, and you really would like it to fit a model, but you don't, you make the model work,
mm-hmm.
fit the data, you don't make the data fit the model. And people don't understand that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get issues where some of the data's floating out here somewhere, or I believe it was a bunch of UK guys messed up their email.
Yes.
And that always,
yeah.
The self-correcting process of science, people don't understand that. They don't understand the need for multiple trials.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One of the things I said in the discussion on Facebook is, I am not worried, if they're telling me lies on the news, at least I should be able to determine that for myself.
Yeah.
And that points to the needs in education, science education. You have to improve the science education process.
I couldn't agree more.
And it doesn't hurt to keep jobs open.
Indeed so. Indeed so.
Oh, one other thing
Yeah.
before I forget.
Mhm.
The nature of Australia, this is purely speculative on my part,
Yeah.
but the nature of Australia being in the southern hemisphere and essentially being the only major body in the southern hemisphere,
Mm.
the dynamics of climate change in the southern hemisphere are not going to be the same
Absolutely.
they've got the Great Barrier Reef. That's got to have an impact on the continent.
Yes.
Um, you what excuse my ignorance, but what part of England are you in? I have a map of England in my mind. Where
I'm
are you?
I'm just south of York, which is
Over on the
um,
east coast?
east east side slightly,
Okay, so
um, and about halfway from London to Edinburgh.
okay. Oh yes, as my wife who's sitting over here on my left pointed out, the Vikings' favorite vacation spot.
Indeed, so Jorvik.
Okay, so the Gulf Stream. See, the Gulf Stream. We're looking here on the east coast of the United States. The Gulf Stream, which goes north of England, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
It clips us most of the time,
yeah.
but our weather can vary radically if the Gulf Stream shifts slightly, which it occasionally does.
See, and the Gulf Stream is, and in terms of what I'm getting at here is when you have any discussion of climate in Australia is going to be slightly different from a climate discussion
Mhm.
in the northern hemisphere simply because of various you know
Yes.
of the bodies. And one thing that always amazed me as I'm sitting here generating talk, I
Mhm.
had a student who was in London when Chernobyl blew up.
Right. Yes.
And Anne was, where were you?
In Norway.
Where? Anne was in Hammerfest at
Mhm.
that time. I have a mental image of weather patterns blowing the cloud eastward. And I find out that it's actually going westward.
Mm-hmm.
And she would tell you,
Yes.
you want to go on camera. She doesn't want to go on camera. She's very beautiful, but she's very shy.
Yes.
But she was in Hammerfest, and they banned the reindeer meat.
Yeah.
You couldn't buy reindeer. That was their primary source of fresh meat, and it was all
Yeah.
banned because of what I'm saying is the weather pattern was totally different from what I would have expected.
Yes. Yes.
And so
Uh,
closing down those jobs in Australia is going to actually do more harm, and they're going to regret it.
I'm inclined to agree. Moving on from which, this is going to take a slightly different tack, bearing in mind we haven't got Elgin, but the Supreme Court seems to have blocked Obama's efforts to comply with the Paris Climate Accord. That worries me considerably because the United States is such a major player in world terms, and the idea that the country is not going to go along with their representatives at the talks um, is disturbing to say the least. Have you any particular feelings?
I haven't had a chance to look at at the details of that. Um, though I suspect when you consider Congress, I don't believe there's been any discussion. I believe if there was ever a discussion in Congress on whether or not to ratify such an accord,
Mhm.
for the lack of a better analogy, it would be almost like acknowledging the Treaty of Versailles, which we agreed to the armistice in 1919, but we did not agree to the to the to the legislation which created the League of Nations, which in turn the League of Nations became.
The United Nations, yes.
Yeah, well, the League of Nations became virtually defunct or powerless
Yeah.
without the presence of one of the major powers, the United States.
Yes, indeed.
You know, and this is the same thing. This any agreement, whether you're talking about Paris or Kyoto,
Hmm.
those weren't, to the best of my knowledge, were never agreed by the Congress. And the present makeup of Congress would never agree to an international accord,
Hmm.
simply because their majority are conservatives.
Yes.
And you know, I can't avoid it. They publicly acknowledge, Congress publicly acknowledged they're working against Obama, and they're the people in the chairmanships. They're the change deniers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is in itself
It's
slightly worrying, talked about from this side of the Atlantic, at least.
it's going to take, one of my analogies is it's going to take the development of a problem that doesn't exist today
Hmm.
to wake everybody up. The math and science explosion of the late 50s and early 60s,
Hmm.
that, we never expected, from my reading of the history, we never expected the Soviet Union to put a satellite into orbit.
Yes.
And they did by the simplest of methods, brute force.
Hmm.
Um, I keep keep waiting for the opening chapters of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy to play out.
Yes. Of course, although it isn't that widely acknowledged, Europe is currently experiencing some really major problems, which to a great extent are due to existing climate change. Because a lot of the trouble in Syria is because they've had a long drought. Almost all the trouble in Africa is because they keep having long droughts, which
Africa,
are unusual compared with previous weather conditions. So we have a huge immigration problem which is resulting from climate change. And if it gets much worse, it's going to look more like an invasion than immigration.
well, also in the case of Africa, the strip, and this is also going to start playing out in Brazil.
Hmm.
It's the stripping of the rainforest, the tropical forest, the desertification. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Sahara is constantly expanding, moving further south.
Yeah.
If you take, and again, going back to what we were talking about on teaching science,
Hmm.
people don't understand how interrelated, things are. You take away the bioform. I believe the correct word is bioform.
Yeah.
You take away you increase the desert. That changes the heating patterns.
Hmm.
I'm not certain that is a problem here. Drought. There's drought in the southeast down in Atlanta, though I think it might have been alleviated. There is a drought in California, and they don't realize that something taking place somewhere else is affecting the outcome. And it's going to, like I said, at some point something's going to happen, and suddenly we're going, hopefully it will occur before the tipping point. And there's Elgin.
Welcome to the call, Elgin.
Hello.
Hello, Elgin.
Finally.
Finally, indeed. We just got as far as the Supreme Court's blocking of Obama's attempts to implement the Paris Accord.
Okay.
We had been agreeing in general terms that this was a terrible thing because the states weren't backing their negotiators in Paris and were weakening world attempts to deal with climate change. You, I think, have a slightly different take on this.
Well, Mike, since I don't accept climate change in that sense, I'm obviously not too upset about them blocking it. For me, this is more, if they had wanted something, if Obama had wanted something, he may have been able to work something out. But the way he went about it, pretty much guaranteed that it would never get through the Senate, and I think that was his fundamental flaw. He tried to bypass the Senate and take this through the EPA, but the courts looks like they're going to say that can't be done. I'm not too surprised.
Mm-hmm.
So in the process, it's one of the reasons a lot of things are getting blocked that could make progress. Not obviously, there's a lot that wouldn't, but even in the places where something could be done, it's getting blocked because he tries to do end runs around Congress. He doesn't like to negotiate very much.
Well, don't we have the situation that Congress have basically said we're not going to go along with anything that Obama tries to put forward anyhow? So there is no negotiation from their point of view.
Well, there could be. I mean, for example, there are 400 bills last year that were sitting in the Senate that got blocked. Many of them were bipartisan. Many of them would have passed Congress on a bipartisan basis, but they got blocked in the Senate because Harry Reid held the filibuster, and therefore they were able to never even reach his desk. So there are things that could be done. On the other hand, Obama has shown a propensity throughout his career to try and run around Congress. I mean, that's why he's been. It's one thing to try and have accusations, but when the Supreme Court has ruled 12 times in 9-0 rulings that he has exceeded his authority, that's indicative of something. Because that's got the liberal members on the court are even saying he's exceeded his authority.
Mm-hmm. Tony, do you have any thoughts on that aspect?
Yeah, I have the conflict between Congress and the president has been going on far too long, and of course I'm on the other side. I see what President Obama doing, rightly or wrongly. I see him doing it because he can't get through Congress. It's kind of, I will admit I don't follow it as much as perhaps I would have 20 years ago. I mean, I'm at this point, like I said, I quit the Democratic Party because I got tired of their approach. If there was an anarchist party.
You mean Trump's party?
Anarchist, yeah. I just right now I'm going to vote. I'm going to vote according to my, I'm going to vote for the candidates I believe in. I've already told, I've written to my senior senator from New York that I will not vote for him, which means I probably will vote third party on the senatorial race. I'm very disillusioned with the whole process.
Yep. It clearly has a problem. Let me give you
the thing is that it's not just President Obama that's got the problem. Congress has got the problem too.
Yeah, but let me give you a concrete example, one that's actually in the courts right now. In the last election, during the last election, Obama was again running on the Congress doing nothing. Marco Rubio put together the DREAM Act. He had worked on it in a bipartisan fashion for Oh, at least 4 to 6 months, and I was following that, and he was within a couple of weeks of having a deal, and within that would have passed Congress and would have gone to the president's desk, and that would have signed. So we would have had that in law. For whatever reason, I have my speculations, but for whatever reason, Obama short-circuited the process within 2 weeks of the bill passing, and just declared all the dreamers. Dreamers are kids who, by the way, Chris, dreamers are kids who have come here because their parents came here illegally. They may have been crossed the border when they were, for example, an infant, but they've grown up in the United States. Do we really want to send those kids back?
Yeah.
The general consensus is no.
Yeah.
And that's something that, like I said, Marco Rubio worked on that quite a bit. He was literally within a couple of weeks of dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's on a bipartisan bill that would have gone through the House and would have gone through the Senate and would have reached the president's desk.
Mm-hmm.
Obama did it by executive action without any of the controls, and illegally, as the courts, I'm sure, will rule, because he created a new classification of law without any law to support it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the type of problem that has poisoned the well for a lot of Republicans wanting to work with him.
Okay.
But also, if I'm not mistaken, Senator Rubio has renounced his own work.
He's renounced his work on the Gang of Eight bill, which was Chuck Schumer. That was a different bill. It was after that bill collapsed that he began working on the DREAM Act.
All right. I just, like
Yeah.
I said, I find the present process very disillusioned. I'm not going to give up my vote. I'm not that dumb. But
I've got to say that looking at it from this side of the Atlantic, yes, the system was originally set up with a whole load of checks and balances, which the founding fathers thought was appropriate. But what appears to have been happening through an awful lot of Obama's presidency is that the checks and balances are such as to make the system stop working almost completely.
Yeah.
And I'm looking from here, and I am seeing a nation which basically doesn't function. Now, looking at it from here, I could see justification in Obama thinking, I'm coming to the end of my term, I am really frustrated with being blocked by House, being blocked by Senate, and if you recall, in the early days, he was trying to do things in a bipartisan way quite a lot, and got blocked a lot. I could well understand him saying, I'm just going to try and get it done now.
I would say, this goes beyond Obama. This has been a problem that's been growing. And if I had to put there's lots of factors, but if I had to put my finger on one of them, I would say that when they changed the filibuster rule of the Senate to require, without having to do debate, the old filibuster was you would stand up, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington movie, you'd stand up on the Senate and you would talk as long as you could stand out. And the process there was to basically focus the nation's attention, focus passion onto an issue. But there was a limit to how long you could talk, and there were rules that governed and limited that process. Well, that was seen too uncivilized. In the 70s, they changed it to where you had to get, effectively, you had to get 60 votes to pass anything. There really was no filibuster per se. It was just you had to get 60 votes on a procedural vote, and if you got blocked, it was a filibuster. That's been growing, and I think one of the things you could do is basically get rid of the filibuster or return it back to its old way.
yeah.
Because what happens on both sides, they get blocked, and then it's a Congress does nothing. It comes out in the budget. I mean, last year the Republicans passed a budget in both houses. They passed all 11 or 12 appropriations bills, and they were all blocked in the Senate. And then basically we had to do one continuing resolution where the government either shut down or they passed the bill with 2 days notice. So get rid of that. In my view, is that let people take the votes, see where they stand, let the president veto or not veto, and go from there. But right now, it just gets blocked unless you follow the procedures very well. And this basically is on both sides. I mean, the Democrats did this to Bush. The Republicans do it. It's too easy to block a bill totally and shut down the Senate. I think that's a big part of the problem.
Great.
Be right. Hang on. I wanted to find something because I happen to agree with Chris, or Elgin rather. When they changed the rules, well, there's some things that are fun. I mean, Strom Thurmond, whom I disagree with, and whose private life proves to be that he disagreed with his own public life, he held a 24-hour filibuster.
Yeah.
Which is the record. And it's amazing, I think it's the record, but there are others. The 60-vote, the cloture rule was always in effect. And what they did that I disagreed with is they simply said all you have to do is say, I am filibustering this bill. I've taken the fun out of it.
Yeah.
I'm sarcastic. And also, I think they're being slightly childish because what has happened is when the Democrats controlled the Senate, if there was a bill the Republicans didn't like, I filibuster, and that stopped it. Now the Democrats are coming back there in the minority. They are, and they're not doing it for me. They're doing it they're childish. You did this to me, I'm going to do this back to you. And yeah, let's use the process the way it was supposed to be done. If you want to have I'm thinking as we were discussing filibusters, I remember an episode on West Wing where a senator went into a filibuster and nobody knew why until one of the White House aides discovered that he had an autistic child and he was simply stalling the bill because he had been ignored in his request for additional funding. Now the question became, how do we break the filibuster, or how do we get it, so it was it was one of the more entertaining West Wing episodes. But I grew up in the for me like I said, I wish they had the traditional rules for a filibuster, simply because you'd probably get more done. Now, on the same token, I grew up in the South, and when I speak of Strom Thurmond, I speak of him withholding and trying to hold my temper, because he at the time that I was growing up, he was a Democrat, but he wasn't a Democrat that I would understand. He later, of course, became a Republican, and they used the filibuster to prevent the laws defining equality from moving forward. And and my study of John Kennedy and my reading of John Kennedy is he knew that if he pushed, he didn't have the 60 votes for cloture, and even with all the arm twisting that Lyndon Johnson did, he almost didn't get the bills passed.
Took the Republicans to do it.
Yeah. The Republicans of 1960 are not the Republicans of 2016.
I'd argue they are, but we discussed that a couple of weeks ago.
No, I was probably asleep. I was probably at work at that time.
Let me move us slightly on. We obviously are well past the halfway point, but we're at about halfway in the bit that Elgin's been able to attend, which is usually when we get to introduce ourselves and plug any books that we have. I will pass on that. I have no books at the moment. I am a mere Energian editor. Tony, would you like to plug anything that you have?
No, I'm still working on. I got my 2 books. I'm still working on it, and I'm trying to
And
You're not,
Elgin.
writing a book is. I'd like if anybody said writing a book was easy. They obviously have never written more than 5 pages.
I have the same problem myself at present. Elgin, do you want to mention your own?
Well, I have 4 books, but I think what I'll mention is if you go over to the Energon Discussion Network, I have a post this morning that went out on same-sex marriage.
Okay. Splendid stuff. And while we do still have some minutes, I think I'd like to move straight to the last item that I had on the sheet, which was also from the discussion network. Steve Kindle posting a defence of Energian's publishing policy following some criticism. Obviously, Energian is prepared to publish people with a very wide range of Christian views. I personally approve of that thoroughly. Do you have any feelings on this?
Who's that directed to?
Either of you, but not Henry.
I think you got to, unless what's being published is antithetical to the concept of the publisher.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking the professor at Wheaton College.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm for that professor.
Yep.
But what she said was in opposition to the very nature of the college where she worked.
Mm-hmm.
She said that Allah was the same as God. Now, I happen to believe that.
Yes.
That is not the opinion of the college. If you're writing, you know, I don't suppose that a Catholic publishing group would ever publish a book in which the author said the Pope was the Antichrist.
True enough.
And I wouldn't expect them to.
Mm-hmm.
But if you say, you know, we haven't yet defined Christianity.
Yes.
So therefore, the spectrum there's a wide spectrum under which you can publish.
Indeed. I mean, I don't think I expect Henry to start publishing any of the new atheists in a hurry, for instance. But Elgin, do you have any further thoughts on this?
I basically agree with that. I mean, there's certain things that I'm pretty sure Henry would not publish, and those would be things along the areas. You know, he is a Christian publisher, so I don't expect any books extolling Islam or Buddhism or other books coming out. He upholds dignity and human rights of people, so I don't expect any racist books or Holocaust-denying books coming out from him. On the other hand, there is within Christianity a very wide range of opinions, and he supports the discussion, and I support him in supporting that discussion. To me, the antidote to bad arguments are good arguments. If I don't like what somebody is saying, then the response isn't to shut them down, it is to respond to them and come back with better arguments. And if I'm losing the arguments, that's more on my fault, and the challenge to me to go do more research and come up with better arguments. So that's where I'm at. I am not opposed, offended to, or shocked by differing points of view.
Mm-hmm.
I disagree with the differing points of view. Of course, my view is the only right view, but it's my obligation to convince everybody of that, and not just to have them suppressed.
Yeah.
By the way, I think I can't speak for Henry, but I think if someone were to propose a book, I'm getting a comparative religion book comparing Islam, Buddhism, Taoism, and Christianity, I think Henry would be one of the first to want to publish that.
Yeah, he's already published a book similar to that on Islam,
Mm-hmm.
but it was from a clearly Christian perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah. I come at it from the point of view of spending some significant time as a sit-up on the Christianity section on the CompuServe Religion Forum, which is now AOL, which perforce basically was labelled Christianity, and there were endless debates as to who was a Christian and who wasn't, with various groups wanting to appropriate the title for themselves and for their particular sets of doctrines. And I really didn't feel that that was healthy in an open forum, shall we say. And to some extent, I like to see a publishing house being an open forum. Also, my own take is very much guided by somebody who said some years ago that his function as a pastor was to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And unless you can occasionally afflict the comfortable, I don't necessarily think you're doing your job properly. So I like to see some alternative viewpoints coming out of the same publishing house. I have in fact done some editing work on some with which I disagreed wholeheartedly, but I attempted to improve them in the process, and certainly approve of the fact that we were publishing those.
Yeah. Again, I think the other benefit of this is if we only talk to ourselves and the people that agree with us, we tend to stereotype the other side. And by talking to each other and by engaging, we actually come up with a much more realistic understanding of what the other side believes.
Mm-hmm.
No argument from me.
I mean, I'm a significantly liberal thinker, theologically speaking, and some years ago I gained immensely by a very long exchange of views with a near fundamentalist Anabaptist, who, however, was a very clear thinker, and he was very good at putting his views and why he thought that way. And I found that it didn't change my mind towards his way of thinking, but it did enable me to improve my thinking immeasurably, and I think that can be valuable to everybody involved. Hey ho.
Yeah. Well, I've actually had my mind changed by some of the discussions.
Okay.
It was on Wednesday. One of my on the Energon Discussion Network, I had another one of my posts on a time that I changed my mind. So there's two plugs for Energon Discussion Network.
I must go back and read that one. But yes, I had my mind changed on the biblical basis for possible same-sex marriage in the course of discussion. My original position was that the Bible really did not accommodate anything of that sort, and I now think, well, there's a possibility that it might, which is obviously a hot topic, but I'm not prepared to say we should go against the Bible, which I was prepared to say, because I'm not certain that the Bible is something to go against there, which encourages me in that respect.
Well, at least we found one area of disagreement today.
Indeed so. We've got about 1 minute before 11 o'clock. Any closing thoughts from anybody?
Well, I would just echo what you all just said. I know what as I sit down and write things, I'm finding how much my own personal thoughts have changed over the years. Mm-hmm. What I knew when I started this journey and what I know today. And what bothers me more than anything else is those who don't make that change, who are not opening to learn.
Yep. So, I think we have arrived at 11 o'clock, and as I do not currently have the controls, if I could say thank you all for watching, have a good week, and I hope to be seeing you again next week.
Okay.